This presentation describes and gives examples of the types of sources used in historical research. There are three types of sources used in historical research: primary, secondary, and tertiary. All three can have a place within student research projects, but it is important to distinguish among them and to be aware of what each type has to contribute to your research. Primary sources are first-hand accounts of historical events documented through newspapers, magazines, autobiographies, memoirs, speeches, and other expressions about the events. It's important to keep in mind that these accounts are first-hand. They are produced at or soon after the time the event occurs or a person lives. Secondary sources are second-hand interpretations of historical events made after the events occurred, often many years after the event occurred. A scholar writing in 2015 about events that took place in 1915 is producing secondary sources such as journal articles or books. Tertiary sources are sources that draw on and summarize primary and secondary sources, such as encyclopedias, almanacs, dictionaries, indexes, and other reference works. Tertiary sources are often found in the reference section of your library. These sources can help you learn background about a topic or an event and can refer you through a references and further readings list to primary and secondary sources. But you should not use tertiary sources within your research papers because they are not peer-reviewed or considered to be scholarly, and they generally do not cite their own sources clearly. Here we see a table with examples of each type of source. The Selected Letters of Theodore Roosevelt collects an assortment of letters that Roosevelt wrote during his lifetime, so they are primary sources. Take a look at the publication date, however. It can be confusing because the date is 2001, obviously long after Roosevelt lived. Here the publication date refers only to when this selection of letters was published in this book edition. When you look at the book, you'll see that the actual letters were written during Roosevelt's lifetime. Often primary source books can be reprinted or compiled many years after the material was first written, so a recent publication date is not always a sign that a source is secondary. The book by Jean Yarborough, Theodore Roosevelt and the American Political Tradition, is a secondary source published in 2012. This scholarly book, published by the University of Kansas Press, relies on primary and other secondary sources for its content and is therefore a secondary source. This book contains lists of references citing many sources, both primary and secondary. The third book is a tertiary source, the Encyclopedia of the American Presidency. This encyclopedia contains entries about Roosevelt and events from his presidency, but also from other presidents, and you'll find much less information here than in a primary or secondary source. It is useful just as basic introduction to Roosevelt as president. First, we'll discuss primary sources further. Primary sources include papers, writings, letters, correspondence, speeches, memoirs, and personal narratives, documents such as a ship's registry, a census record, an interview transcript, or a court case, and newspaper articles published when or soon after an event happened. Here on the right, we have the opening page to the document of the court case Plessy v. Ferguson. Here we have a newspaper article from March 26, 1911, describing the Triangle Fire when it happened. As a first-hand account, it is a primary source. Remember that you can find historical newspapers on microfilm and also digitized within databases within the Odum Library collection. Another example of a primary source is the Civil War Diary, a Confederate nurse, the Diary of Ada W. Bacot, 1860 to 1863. Here are the title and publication information pages for this work, reprinted by the University of South Carolina Press in 1994. Chapter 1 opens the diary then with entries from September and November 1860. While the diary itself is a primary source, the new information included in this book is secondary source material. The contents page shows a series editor's introduction, preface, and an introduction written by the editor of this book Jean V. Berlin. Note how the opening page of the introduction shown here describes events in Nurse Bacot's life in third person rather than first person. That's another clue that the introduction is a secondary source, with the book's editor writing about the events of Bacot's life more than a century after Bacot lived. You can find many primary sources online where they have been digitized and published. For instance, the Digital Library of Georgia, a collection available through Galileo, includes a scanned collection of African American funeral programs that can tell much about family traditions and culture during the period 1933 to 2008. More primary source collections online are available through museums, libraries, archives, and other organizations. For instance, the Library of Congress's American Memory Project collects digitized photographs, manuscripts, recordings, correspondence, and many more primary source materials that document the times they represent. Likewise, the National Archives publishes many historical documents online, including the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Another digital library is HathiTrust, which collects thousands of images, government documents, books, pamphlets, and other materials, many of which, though not all, are primary, such as the booklet by Upton Sinclair shown on the left. Another digital library is the Internet Archive, which makes freely available online documents, recordings, and many other sources. For instance, the Internet Archive includes a collection of more than 10,000 digitized recordings of the band The Grateful Dead. VSU's Archives and Special Collections Department provides hands-on access to primary materials as well as to many digitized historical documents. The Archives has the Pinecone yearbooks available both in print and online. The Archives are located on the 4th floor of Odom Library. Now we'll further discuss secondary sources, which are interpretations of past events rather than first-hand accounts of those events. A primary source gives you a sense of how people from that time viewed an event, whereas a secondary source looks at the event through the lens of distance and historical viewpoint. Authors can rely on both primary and secondary sources to create new secondary sources, such as scholarly journal articles and books, also called monographs. This 2004 peer-reviewed article from the Journal of Southern History is a secondary source that interprets events from 1912 through primary sources such as courtroom trial transcripts, as explained in Note 1. Notice in particular that the author of the article, Randall Hall, is writing in third person about a court case that occurred in 1912, another sign that this source is secondary. Another peer-reviewed article here opens with an abstract in which the author summarizes her analysis and argument in this essay about events in 1916. Clearly, the author here is interpreting in 2013 events that occurred almost a century in the past, so this article, which relies on a mix of primary and secondary sources, is considered a secondary source. Earlier, we looked at a newspaper article from 1911 describing the tragic Triangle factory fire in New York City. Here is another New York Times article, this time from 2011, memorializing the loss of life in the Triangle tragedy. This article addresses the event from the vantage point of 100 years later and is therefore a secondary source. Remember that newspaper articles at the time of or soon after an event are usually primary sources, but an article in a magazine or newspaper recalling and interpreting that event from a greater distance will be a secondary source. With books in particular, it can be difficult to tell if they are primary or secondary sources. These three biographies are all secondary sources in which the authors write about and interpret Calvin Coolidge, Isabella Stewart Gardner, and Eugene Debs, all early 20th century figures. A biography is told from a second-hand viewpoint, whereas an autobiography, memoir, or diary is a first-hand account. Remember the Civil War nurse's diary we discussed earlier. The book could be considered either a primary or secondary source, depending on whether you cite the diary itself, a primary source, or the introduction and other material from the editors, secondary sources. Tertiary sources in history serve as summaries or digests of information about a historical event or person. Tertiary sources include encyclopedias, dictionaries, almanacs, handbooks, and other reference works. While they often draw from primary and scholarly secondary sources, tertiary sources are considered third-hand and not scholarly. They usually do not go through a peer review process before publication. These tertiary sources are usually located in the reference section of a library. They can help you understand the background of a topic, but you should not include tertiary sources in your research papers about history because they are not original research and usually do not cite their sources clearly. Not all tertiary sources identify themselves as encyclopedias. In these three examples, both the Presidential Slogans, Campaigns, Issues, and Platforms book and the Encyclopedia of American Urban History identify themselves as encyclopedias in either the title or the subtitle, and both have relatively short entries about their topics. But the title Rebels and Renegades is less clearly a tertiary source if you consider just its title and the length of the essays it contains. However, the essays do not cite their sources, but merely list a bibliography of references at the end of each essay. Therefore, the book is considered a tertiary source. It is unclear which source provided which information, so this tertiary source is less valuable for your own research. As we see in the entry below from the Encyclopedia of American Urban History, in some cases tertiary sources include a list of references and/or suggestions for further reading. These suggestions can lead you to primary and secondary sources. Here, the further readings and references for an entry about women's world fairs list two primary sources, which you can then seek on your own to use for your research. Let's briefly review how you can use the three types of sources for your own research. First, examine primary sources to interpret and develop your ideas about events and people. Use these sources as evidence for your theories. Rely on secondary sources to review other scholars' viewpoints about events and people and to build your own argument in relation to what others have written. Finally, use tertiary sources only for introductory background information to build greater familiarity with your topic, and don't cite them as sources for your research project. If you have further questions about the types of sources you're using for your research, be sure to ask your course professor or a reference librarian